Hi, I'm Seamless, and today is Friday, which means it's time for a new How to Bass tutorial. And today I am very pleased to be showing you a sound in a track that I'm working on. The sound, I'm just going to play the track because I think it's dope, but the sound is this guy. Whenever you see these guys happen, that's the sound. It happens a bunch, it'll be quite clear. Anyway, this sound, this track is super duper loud. It's turned down already by the nature of how my recording works, but it's still pretty freaking loud. So, if you're turned up, I suggest you turn down for this. Playing in 3, 2, 1. I haven't finished that part yet. Anyway, this bass is super fun. In case you missed it, this is the sound. So, what I like about this sound is that this is a sound, like it's almost like spot on with a sound that I used to have to do a lot of work to make. And it wasn't so much that I was trying to make this sound, so I'm not quite going to say that it was by accident, but I used a lot of the same materials, and it just seemed to work out this time. Anyway, this is a patcher patch, unsurprisingly. And this is what's going on, and there's also some stuff in post. There's a reverb, and there's an EQ. I'm going to actually turn off that. I'm going to turn off the sidechain effects. I'm going to turn off the master effects, so we can hear what this sound sounds like completely naked. Well, post-patcher anyway. So that's what that sounds like. Now let's dive into what's going on here. So this looks kind of weird. You can see the two Vocodexes. You might be wondering what's going on. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that this whole thing at the bottom, all this stuff, like this is only here to actually add a bit of beef to the sound. Because when it was just originally this, I thought that it lacked, like in the mix anyway, it lacked a particular kind of beef. So this is actually just layering in some beef. That's the beef. And it's using the vocoding here because I'm actually just using essentially the contour of the output sound to infer what this very harsh sounding harshness sounds like coming out. So that's what that's for. But all the rest of the important stuff's happening up here. So this is a citrus and a citrus. I'm using another citrus as the modulator for the carrier. Not news. You've seen me do this before, but you'll be I think you might be surprised about what exactly is lending the most impact in terms of the modulation. So let's first look at what the carrier sounds like before Vocodex. So we have it's being started. Actually, let's look at it totally naked. So just citrus by itself. Bam. So there's actually quite a bit going on in there, even just from the first go, the get-go. The first oscillator is what you see when I take a saw wave and I transform it into sine harmonics and then randomize phases. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this is when you go to making a saw wave, and if you right-click it, it says convert shape to sine harmonics, and it'll recreate the waveform, whatever it is, in sine harmonics. Which is essentially, like, this is basically additive. This is additive synthesis, and it's kind of like how Harmor works. And then down here, there's an option for randomizing phases, and it'll screw with the waveform. This gives it a blurry kind of not very solid texture, which sounds like this. Versus this. Now, one key difference is that I actually took a swath of harmonics and flattened them out. And that's because the sharpness comes from a lot of the harmonics being, phases being aligned. The saw wave sounds the way that it does, even when it's all its high harmonics, because the harmonics are all aligned. They all start at the same time, and so that's where the sharpness comes from. And when they're all different, that's why it's blurred like that. So if I make some of them, especially the lower harmonics, if I make the lower harmonics more together, then you hear a bit of that teeth coming back. so on and so forth. That's not what I want to do. Whatever. Anyway, I made that waveform in operator 1. Operator 2 is ring modulating operator 1 by this shape, which you accomplish by hitting the half and even option that are up here, which transforms the waveform from being a fully oscillated positive and negative to being just a positive. And then it does half the waveform. But I mean, even that was already kind of like small. But the purpose of this is basically like putting a volume envelope on the sound at the oscillator level. So each oscillation is essentially only letting a sound come through during that moment of the oscillation, which makes it very, very sharp sounding. Which is neat. And then it is being FM'd by operator 3, which is just a sine wave. So normally when I modulate FM, which I'm doing here, what I would do is I would go to the operator that's being modulated, go to the modulation tab, and link it to mod X. Mod. But what I'm doing here is I'm actually modulating just the volume of operator 3, because if I did that, it would also modulate the ring modulation, which actually did sound pretty cool when I did it by accident, but that's not what I wanted, because I wanted the sharpness to be maintained throughout the entirety of the modulation. So RM is free to go forever, and FM is going to be controlled directly by changing the volume of the modulating operator, which is how this sound is created. Then it's being distorted, just with a straight up regular saturation, which we hear constantly. Me using it. Whoa, come on. There we go. Which just gives it some more heft. And then I'm putting a flanger in there for good measure. Just to put more holes in the spectrum is really what that's for. The flanger settings are just pretty, there's really nothing special about this going on. I probably could even just live without it, but it sounds neat, so I'm using it. And then that goes in the Vocodex. So now let's look at what the modulator is doing. This is what the modulator sounds like outside of Vocodex. So if you've watched any of my older How to Bases, this sound should be seriously familiar to you. And that's because it is a triangle wave with a higher harmonic modulating a sine wave. And that's really just what it sounds like. It's not really that different because of the EQ, but what the EQ is doing is something a bit special. I've created what looks like a weird little spectral bra, and I'm modulating one up the other while it moves around. And that just kind of puts emphasis in the particular parts of the spectrum differently. And I honestly, I just do not keep track of which one's which in the automation stack. I guess I could tell. This is the modulation. This is the modulation of the second FM, and this is the modulation of the two EQs. And I think that might actually be a different sound. Now that I think about this, no, it's the same sound. And what's that balance? I forget what the balance is. That's this. No, but that's this. This volume envelope thing is this guy. What are you? We'll find out in a second. But this is sort of what that EQ is for. And then that's going into Vocodex. Now we can look at what all this sounds like in Vocodex. I'm passing the Vocodex through a tiny bit of reverb to get a bit of room, and then it's all being compressed quite heavily to even out the spectrum. One thing that Vocodex does when you modulate stuff that tends to lack on the high end. There's actually things you could do in Vocodex to fix that, but it's also a lot easier just to use compression. Because for the most part, when you try to EQ it out, it's the classic case of why dynamic range is difficult to mix. Because there are certain aspects of like, it's kind of like de-essing. When you talk, you have a whole bunch of sibilants, plus, like that range of frequencies that in like actually exists in also has an important sonic quality for when you're not doing that. Like regular normal vowel sounds have a quality of the higher frequencies that sounds good when you EQ it up a bit. But if you do that, then it becomes way too overpowered. Hence de-essing, which is basically just compressing just that section. And that allows it so that the regular normal stuff can keep at its regular normal level, and then the S's get pulled down to that level. And when you EQ everything, it all EQs everything pretty much balanced. And that's more or less the purpose of having a compressor, a multiband compressor, specifically, with the high end being very specifically focused on. After something like a vocoder, which does all this filtering and destroys, the evenness of the spectrum and creates a lot of dynamic range. That's why I do that. And then this final EQ, which is just, I guess, doing that. I'm not totally sure why it's there, but whatever. That's what it sounds like. But let's look at the Vocodex, because this is where some of the cool stuff happens. So the sound is already, like, you listen to the modulator, you listen to the carrier. it's this guy is being modulated. Oh, let's actually see what the stack is here. Okay, so we have, yeah, that's the different sound that I was looking at. So, modulator, modulator, band, band, and then the Vocodex pitch. So, and then this is the secondary thing I told you about before. So, I'm actually automating this guy, which I think which for some reason it's not showing that it's moving. It is moving. Patcher stuff does that sometimes, but whatever. Anyway, what's happening here is I got 23 bands, order all the way up. I have a little bit of the mod coming through, the modulator coming through. I think it comes in by default. I guess I don't know if I actually turn that off, but it's high pass pretty high, so it's not going to sound like much. And then I have the low kind of in there, which considering how low I passed that down to like the 100 hertz, I guess that's still kind of in there. I am high passing everything in the mix. I'm replacing it with the sub, which is really what this does. It allows you to put in the sub from the original source because for the most part, modulated sources don't have a lot of low frequency activity, so it's hard for it to kind of match up. However, I am using an actual, like the same pitch level bass modulator as a modulator, so that's a thing. As such, actually, it was important to point out, if you go down to the band distribution level, this thing, which is super busted right now, by default, is up here like this. And what this is essentially saying is that this being normal distribution, this is saying that if there was a base level like activity in the band down there, it actually gets pushed up to be in this range. So if I actually went all the way up here, this would be saying that like that down there is what used to be the lowest base level, and it got pushed up to being higher than that. But because, like I said, I'm using an actual base level modulator, I bring it all the way back down, so we have all of that range. I have a little bit of the bandwidth changed. So what this graph does, if you've never seen it, this drop-down menu is for these parameters that are up here. It allows you to make changes to those parameters on a per band basis. This graph is basically saying that this area has more bandwidth and this area has less bandwidth. And you can see that reflected in the size of the bands. And same thing with the modulator pitched. This is saying that these particular bands get moved down, these bands get moved up, which kind of causes this squish in the middle, which gives us that little like sort of an angry-ish like kind of sound, which is just such bullshit to have just said that and that doesn't help you anything whatsoever. That's what we call a buzzword, when you say things that just have no practical meaning, and really we can just see what it's doing and we can hear what it sounds like, so it's not worth doing. But that's why I did what I did, though. What else? I left the attack in the head and whatever, and the release all there. I didn't really change any of that. I did bring down a little bit of the filter fatness. Usually it's all the way up, but I brought it down. I think it's all the way up usually. I'm not totally sure. But that prevents that particular kind of glassy sound when you have particularly thin bandwidth. But this bandwidth is just a little bit thin to the point where that was a bit necessary. But I also kind of like the way that some of that particular glassiness sounds. And in fact, one of the reasons why this sound is working at all right now, because I've done this before where I tried to make this kind of like almost Joe 40 sounding kind of thing with the ring modulated citrus bass modulator into a vocoder, and it's usually just too bleedy. It's too bloody, and it didn't stay sharp. And one of the things that's causing the sharpness right now is the interaction of the band count. And the fact that there's just the act of it being split into bands. In fact, if you're a fan of snails, one of the very simple trick you can do is just put a saw wave into a vocoder and mess around with the bandwidth and band count. Nothing else. Don't even modulate it with anything. Make it modulate itself. And just see how just the fact that it got split up into bands kind of gives it that texture. And this texture right now, in the exact settings that we have set up right here, is working for this sound, to help it actually get to the actual like behavior that I had wanted. I didn't mean to do that, but that's what happened. So with the automation, this guy here is the original citrus, the carrier modulator, and this is the modulator. And these are the two things on the EQ, which when I move them around, there's not like that much of an impact, but if they're just right with the movement of the other modulators, there's enough of an impact that it actually starts to matter. And then there's the modulator pitch shift, which just adds an extra layer of just change to things. And then this guy is that secondary dude I was talking about. But what I wanted to mention is that with this modulator here and modulator here, they both have very large impact on how the sound sounds, but it's like it's a bit difficult trying to like juggle the two of them. I do something later. Yeah, this here. Like this change is causing it to sound like that kind of a sharp impact because of that. But if I did that with this guy, basically the same kind of impact would happen because it has about as much importance on the movement as the other guy does, which is just a very interesting thing. And if you think about it, a lot of my older modulator basses, like even my oldest ones from like Bass Addicts, used a similar concept where it was actually that other bass, the triangle wave with the harmonic, that was the carrier, and then the modulator was the vocal. So both the carrier and the modulator both have very modulable things happening, and the combination of the two causes something a bit more interesting together that they individually could not have themselves. So that's the purpose of that. But let's look at that secondary thing. So the secondary thing, like I said, its purpose in life was to add just a bit more grit to the totality of the sound. And the original sound, just that, which is a whole lot of that saw wave stuff I was telling you about before with the randomized phases and just an extra sine wave to give it oomph. Goes into be distorted. Oh my god. How many times do I gotta right click the same spot for it to know I'm there? Which does that, which is a fun way to do like a kind of a in high, not necessarily as heavy, but in specific versions of that you can get a pretty cool sounding Z-ish bass, which is neat. And then I EQ'd it to kind of give it that neuro-y feel. And the neuro-y feel, if you didn't know what that is basically just a gigantic notch at 200 hertz. That makes it sound like anything from 2006. So that's do you see me clicking this thing? That's why I did that. Now I have this guy, and I think I have it off by default. And basically, what happened was that sounded cool and had the kind of grit that I wanted, but I didn't match the profile of the sound at all. And I wanted to match the profile. And there's a couple ways I could have done that, and I chose essentially to take the easy route, which was to vocoded by the vocoded sound, and use really big bands. The really big bands are there because I really want just the general, super generic, not all that impressively tight version of it, so that I have all that extra stuff in there, because I do want the other harmonics that are not related to the original sound to add to the original sound. And I'm doing that with this free balance. So I'm actually modulating it in there against it, so that like, because I do like how the sound sounds by itself and the kind of the tight way that it sounds. So I don't really want to screw with that, but I do want to like sort of add atmospherically that grit in there. And so I'm very much controlling when that happens, so that the cool parts can still be cool. Now, on the top of all this, I have an EQ that I forget what I was doing. Apparently not much. I think I tried to do something and it wasn't a lot. I just got rid of it. But then there's this guy. Now, this block of cheese you're looking at is what a reverb looks like when it has almost no diffusion. So normally a reverb is very dense, right? It's basically a delay that's very dense. And this example is an example of what it looks like when it's not all that dense. And I did that because I wanted it actually just basically like stereoizing help, where the sound is so sharp and clangy that if I really block out, like to make the stereo kind of in there and put on this kind of reverb, it just sort of reverberates in such a way that it doesn't do that tinny softness that ends up happening, but instead it just creates sort of ambient sharpness, which is actually kind of hard to notice when everything's playing together. And boy, does that sound stupid without the sidechaining and mastering. You tend to only notice it like in that moment where everything dropped out. And you don't really hear that as being a reverb. You hear that as being like some kind of this interesting like smear that gets applied to the original sound. But it is a reverb. That's what causes that. I mean, that and sidechaining. Just in case you think there are, I just want you to know there are no strings in this song, all synths. In fact, I mean, if you were to hear them by themselves, they wouldn't even sound like they were strings. But for some reason, just the way that they're applied, they kind of sound like strings and shit happening, doesn't it? I think I might do a how to synth on that, because that is a sort of an overarching thing that you can do, not just in specific instances as such. Anyway, I'm going to put up this patcher to download. This guy. Grit and everything. I am using Valhalla Room, but if you don't have that, I mean, just whatever. Put some reverb in there. I have no idea what happens when you try to open up a patcher when it has a plugin you don't have in there. I'm pretty sure I put up stuff before that had third-party stuff that not everyone might not have had, but whatever. Hopefully I've said enough about how the sound was made that if all else fails, you can just make it again. Because I want you to learn stuff. Anyway, this patcher, I'll give it to you. If you have any questions about that, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day.